Whoops. Okay, good morning. So welcome to UWC, and I'll give you a moment just to find a seat and settle down. You can see a couple of people. I feel very short here. Okay. So I'm very honored today to be able to welcome you to Cape Town, to UWC, and specifically to our symposium, where we're going to talk over the next few days about the role of universities in strengthening the protection of democratic values and human rights defenders. And I'm not a fan of podiums. I like to walk and talk. But can you hear me if I do that? No. Well, if I talk really loudly. No. See, like magic. Thank you very much. So I'm too short to be behind a podium. Then I feel. So yes, I am very, very excited that it is UWC that is hosting this symposium because we have a very rich history of struggling for and protecting democratic values. But what is most exciting to me is that that is not just part of our history. That is now part of our contemporary current approach to how we think about our role as a university. We are still a place that is supporting human rights defenders and finding how we can protect democratic values. So thank you, I want to say in advance, to our Rector for supporting these initiatives and to our university who have over the years given us this space to grow what we do here. So indeed, over the next 2 days, we are going to be thinking about what is the role that universities can play in supporting democratic values and in thinking about what human rights means and those activists who try to build human rights values. Our intention is to provide an opportunity to reflect critically on current challenges that face civil society and universities across the globe, share new insights and research on this topic, but most importantly, to explore how we can strengthen approaches that contribute to the expansion of democratic space and what we can do in concrete terms to support human rights defenders. I think the symposium comes at a very important juncture in our global societal challenges that we're facing. And on Monday, this became very apparent when the Secretary General of the United Nations said these words at the opening of the Human Rights Council in Geneva, to quote, "Human rights are under a full-scale attack around the world. The rule of law is being outmuscled by the rule of force. And this assault is not coming from the shadows or by surprise. It is happening in plain sight and often led by those who hold the greatest power. Around the world, human rights are being pushed back deliberately, strategically, and sometimes proudly. When human rights fall, everything else tumbles. Peace, development, social cohesion, trust, solidarity." So those words that he spoke on Monday are very powerful and are a very timely reminder that we're at a crossroads in society where we need to defend basic democratic practices like freedom of expression, equality of representation. But we're also at a time where we need to recognize that we as people are the infrastructure of democracy. We cannot hope that somebody else is going to do this work out there for us, that institutions in the state will uphold democratic values now because they did in the past. It's important to remember that institutions are made up of people, and we are those people. We are the infrastructure. And so that's why it is wonderful to see everyone in the room today, because we recognize this is a responsibility we have to take forward. So it's our intention this week and in the next 2 days to both reflect on threats to civic space, human rights, and democracy. But actually, we also want to come away by the end of tomorrow with some clear action plans. I'm sorry to say your to-do lists might get just a little bit longer because we want to think about how do we actually build strong multi-stakeholder ecosystems that can stay in place not just today, next month, but into the future. This morning, we will start with a set of talks from a panel of people who've been thinking about this issue for a long time. And then we'll continue with that with some group work this afternoon. Yes, you won't be able to rest on your laurels. We'll be doing lots of group work the next few days. And tomorrow, in particular, in the morning, we'll be looking at how 2 universities have introduced guidelines for hosting human rights defenders, particularly learning from best practice from the Center for Applied Human Rights at the University of York and from our own African Universities Hub for Human Rights at UWC. Before I conclude, I do want to thank the very important key partners who have made this symposium possible. Firstly, it's also just to note before I also thank them that actually we had a symposium 3 years ago in 2023, and that was at the start of an idea. We didn't have a university's hub for human rights. We didn't have a fellowship program. We didn't have summer schools. And that symposium 3 years ago led to what we now have established in our university and what will continue for many years to come as being a university that is able to provide rest and respite for human rights defenders as well as training for human rights activists in the African continent. So the reason I'm saying that is that these symposia are not just an opportunity to talk, they're an opportunity to build something as well. For this symposium, initially, our intention was to gather around 30 people, or 25 actually, in a small workshop. But we were so happy to see that the level of interest was very high. And actually, we've got closer to 50 participants. And as you'll all get to know each other, you'll realize from all over the world as well. And so we do very much want to welcome all of you to our space. I'm not sure some of you may be new. I spoke to someone as they first visit to Cape Town this week. And you may not know, but Cape Town is colloquially called the mother city. And I really like that term, particularly when we're hosting, because it invokes the idea that you will be looked after as a mother would care for their family. And I hope indeed you will find yourselves well fed and well nurtured. But if you ever have any challenges and you feel you're not being well nurtured, please come and find one of us from the team, starting with myself and Dr. Dube, and we can help you with anything you need. So now, before I conclude, I do want to thank the key partners who've made the symposium possible. Firstly, while we've come a long way at UWC in building our university's hub for human rights, this work was very much inspired and guided by Paul Grady, who holds the UNESCO Chair for the Protection of Human Rights and Defenders and the expansion of political space. So thank you very much to your chair, Paul, for both your intellectual, moral, and financial support. Thank you also to our core donors, to the Ford Foundation, and to SIRE, the Norwegian Students and Academic International Assistance Fund, for supporting the work we do, not just financially, but also with the good wishes and the input that you give us with your guidance and your wisdom too. This event has been arranged by our wonderful PUG team, and PUG is not a collection of adorable puppies, although I hope sometimes we're adorable. It stands for the Politics and Urban Governance Research Group. So thank you very much to the team in the background who have made the event possible. But in particular, I want to thank Millie Dube for his leadership of this hub and all the very quiet work that goes on in the background. There isn't a person here that Millie would not have spoken to at some points, and many others across the world where he's quietly building the important work of making connections. And thank you also very much to Neo Fumba at the back there for ensuring that we all got here safely, soundly, and the event will go smoothly. And then, of course, thank you very much to everyone in this room. Time is the most precious commodity we have. We only get about 4,000 weeks on this planet, and that you've chosen to spend part of one of those with us today talking about very important issues. We are grateful for that. So we hope this is going to be an interesting, exciting, collaborative, but also productive 2 days. Thank you very much. I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Dube to just introduce the panel and our first speaker. Are you happy to do this? Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. I'm tall enough to stand behind the the podium, so I won't need this one. I'll put it down. Um, I've been given the honor to introduce our rector, um, Professor Robert Balfour, who will give us our opening this morning. Maybe before I introduce him, I think I should say that when we started this work, we were quite skeptical about how the universities are quite risk-averse places that say, okay, human rights defenders, human rights, thinking of all those authoritarian governments across the world that can follow you all the way down to South Africa, some of them. And I must say, this started with the previous rector, but when Prof. Balfour came, we also found him very receptive and accepting of the ideas and wishing to continue with the leaders of the previous in actually supporting our work. So without much ado, you would have received, all of you, each participant's brief in terms of who is in the room. We try to make sure that we facilitate as much networking as possible. Unfortunately, the rector won't be here for that long because he has other meetings to attend to. But would like to welcome him on stage to give us his opening remarks and help us just set the tone for today and tomorrow's event. Prof. Balfour, I'd like to invite you on stage. This one.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Dr. Dube, for the introduction. Thank you to Prof. Anciano also for welcoming us formally this morning to this event. It is a privilege for me to be able to spend at least some time with you at the start of the day on a topic that is so relevant, so timely in our global environment, in our young and nascent democracy. The matter, of course, concerns human rights and the protection of democratic values. And in the abstract, this always sounds logically self-defensible and self-evident. That there should be rights, that they should be possible to exercise within a democracy appear at face value to be self-evident. But from every experience of human suffering that we have to account for in both contemporary life and in our histories, it's quite evident that rights can never be assumed, that they must always be the subject of contestation, that they are only ever recognized when, in fact, they are contested and fought for. And although that is quite a sobering remark, and perhaps we might also then consider, what are the conditions that produce the contestation about human rights and the contestation that occurs always in the environments that we find ourselves in, where resources are form the basis also of the contest. Then we have to link, of course, an understanding of human rights to essential questions about violence in our society and our seeming incapacity to control either the onset of violence or its diminishment. I'm so conscious when making these remarks of the work, I think it was by Steven Pinker, and I can't remember the title of the book offhand now, in which he made a case for the 21st century being witness to the least conflict in human society. I think it was an understanding of, how many deaths over how many conflicts have occurred in the past and so on. But in fact, that explanation I find is a kind of cold comfort about the diminishment of violence over historical periods, because in fact, the analysis loses the growing disparity between wealth and poverty, the growing inaccessibility of unemployed populations to decent living and participation in thriving and democratic economies, the growing inaccessibility of capital to its production base, and so on. So There are these unnerving, disquieting trends in our economic existence that have a direct link to violence, that then also have a very direct link to how rights come to be understood, how they come to be lived out. So when I say this is a timely event, and I think about the privilege of being able to come together this morning, it's very much with these thoughts in mind that I want to share with you. And let me just block that call. Professor Greedy and members of the panel, Prof. Nadar and Prof. Brian Cajoro and Miss Gloria Kimani, thank you so much also for making yourselves available this morning. And of course, Prof. Anciano has mentioned our partners who assisted and have supported the organization of this event, our civil society organizations and our donors. All of you, students as well as staff, are very warmly welcome to the symposium on strengthening universities' roles in the protection of democracy and human rights. At UWC, of course, it's also timely for us to be able to recognize this initiative within the faculty. It's one that I've watched keenly since my arrival at UWC and have enjoyed seeing the growth and development and activism that is associated with this particular group, the PAG group. When I talk also about activism at UWC, this is one of the exemplary initiatives that I think combines the activist and the scholarly dimension and seeks to make a difference in the world, both in and around us today. So it is with that sense of pleasure, Prof, that I'm grateful to be here with you. It's being convened through its African Universities Hub for Human Rights in collaboration with the UNESCO Chair, as we've mentioned, and with the Protection of Human Rights Defenders Initiative, and the expansion of political space, and of course UWC's Chair on Citizenship and Democracy. And the symposium asks a central question: what indeed is the responsibility of universities when democratic spaces contract, when they shrink around us? We meet under this theme of strengthening the role of universities in precisely the environment of context, of contestation and diminishment. And over these next few days, I hope that there'll be some fairly tough conversations about how universities can both change the nature of the spaces which we consider to be diminishing and how we can in fact open up new spaces together. Across many parts of Africa and the global south, the environment for civic action is regulated. So in as much as it is a space of contestations, it's also a highly regulated space. Human rights defenders face scrutiny. They've often been the subject of violence. They've often faced direct intimidation. Restrictions are placed on their movements. Banning orders are not uncommon in our history in South Africa, and we find across the globe these types of measures being enacted or being resurrected to control the nature and the form of contest. Dinah Lupin, in a comparative study of South Africa and Ethiopia, shows how regulatory shifts operate through administrative requirements, funding rules, and discretionary enforcement. Nowadays, we talk about donor agendas more and more prominently in relation to the kinds of work that universities can do or which they are not invited to do. And that occurs in the context of diminishing state resources to do the important research that universities as democratic institutions should be doing to strengthen democratic life. Similarly, Rosie McGee shows how during crises, emergency measures can come to be seen as normalized and absorbed into routine governance and government. We had experience of this in South Africa in our history of the emergency decrees and regulations which were pervasive over a number of years and which seemed to become a kind of normal, a normalized environment, but which in fact are a spectacular abnormality in terms of curtailments of freedoms. So the effect of these normalized measures that are then absorbed into routines is a cumulative effect. The boundaries then of lawful association come to be tighter and tighter, and the capacity for human beings to organize themselves in those very tight and narrow environments is then, of course, um, sufficiently constrained, so to speak, and inevitably ruptures follow. Inevitably, ruptures follow. This pattern is precisely what seems to avoid scrutiny. I'm just thinking now of Naomi Klein's book. I think it was it The Shock Doctrine, in which she analyzed how crises, environmental crises and other crises, come to be used by governments to further curtail the association, demonstration, activism, opposition. So we should not think of our spaces in relation to the economic environments in which the resources are being increasingly contested as being kind of naturally produced. These circumstances are often constructed circumstances with a particular political and economic endpoint that has been planned for. Debates within higher education, of course, mirror the wider global context. The Kampala Declaration reminds us that intellectual freedom is indeed linked to a strong sense of social responsibility, and it identifies academic freedom as essential to this, and notes that when that freedom is compromised, democratic culture is weakened. Paul Greedy and Emma Jackson argue that universities can act as instigators, as incubators and protectors of democratic norms, but only where the autonomy is sufficiently protected and governance systems are robust enough to nurture that autonomy. So we cannot, even in an institutional frame where autonomy is considered to be a norm, like in a university, we cannot assume that the principle of autonomy will kind of be in itself an uncontested principle. In fact, the regulatory pressures from the state in the name of oversight of the public purse and so on are often experienced as being quite interfering in universities' functioning. And our experience suggests that principle can be improvised in relation to the needs of the state. So accountability can be demanded, which sounds like the right thing to do from a public institution, demand public accountability. But the experience of enforcement of that accountability can in fact have this effect of narrowing, reducing, diminishing the autonomy of the institution. And that's why vigilance is so necessary, why assumptions about rights cannot be easily kind of thought about. They have to be thought about with a considerable amount of difficulty and scrutiny. And strategy, of course, is also not always sufficient on its own. University strategy, institutional strategies to promote and celebrate autonomy and human rights have to always be met by enough passion and action and commitment. That the plans and the visions are not also enough, even in this context of an autonomous environment. And yet we do think of universities, despite even these difficulties I've mentioned, as protective institutions. We do think of ourselves as institutions where we try at best to model what we think an ideal democracy can feel like, an ideal education system can be like, an ideal student experience and staff growth experience can be, practiced. We think of these institutions as the place where you can do that kind of work. But of course, all over this world at this particular time, the role of universities and the capacity to effect that role is, of course, not entirely clear. Greedy and Jackson note that this relative autonomy then can enable us to some extent to act where others cannot, but of course it's always a space that has to be guarded. It's never a guaranteed or neutral space, and it requires an active sense of stewardship. And I think in a university such as this one, where I often talk to our staff about stewardship, and people sometimes hear stewardship to mean austerity. Austerity means budget cuts, stewardship. But the point about stewardship rather than austerity and cuts is that stewardship involves a notion of how do you care best? How do you care best with the resource that you have, rather than how do you simply cut what you think you can't afford. There's quite a careful difference in nuance. And the nuance is important because the stewardship principle invites us all in. An austerity principle is a budget-driven, balance sheet-driven agenda, rather than an agenda that's driven by this notion of how do we care best with the resource that we have. And we tried to use this space at UWC of stewardship, as I think of it, responsibly. The African Universities Hub for Human Rights emerged in the collaboration with the UNESCO Chair at the University of York in 2023. And since then, we have stewarded, so to speak, produced 9 human rights defenders that have completed 3-month fellowships alongside summer schools, thanks to the work that has been nurtured through this chair. So it does show over time that with institutional support and principled commitment to an intellectual community that is working under pressure, that things can be done. It's not all about constraint and limitation and kind of fiscal diminishment. Hosting, however, is only one form of protection. So coming together today is also a form of protection. It's a way of acknowledging that we safeguard each other, we protect each other, and that when we do so, we recognize that we do face risks here. There's political pressure, as I've mentioned. There's regulatory intervention. There are funding constraints. As Lupin cautions, even our regulatory systems that appear to be facilitative can, in fact, be narrowing. We recognize that that is a real factor in our environment. So in my closing remarks, I want to just touch on this last point about how we carry our responsibility in the engagement. We are a civil society organization. We're also a public good organization. We are a public institution. We depend on our public understanding our role in society, and we have a responsibility to nurture and enrich our public through that understanding of how that role as an institution comes to be activated, how it comes to be manifested, how it comes to be experienced. For us at UWC, the issues that are under discussion here about how we understand our role as a public institution, as a public good partner, are therefore really important in this first year of our new institutional operating plan, because notions like freedom, autonomy, and protection of rights are very much aligned to the institution's values. So when I talk about activism to our scholars and activism to our students and why that is important at UWC in terms of our history, it's very much with this sense that the scholarly should make a change. The scholarly cannot only be the reflective engagement and self-reflective purpose of intellectual work. There is, of course, always that in it, but we must fundamentally commit to this notion that we make a change, that we should be making a change as an institution. If when we leave here, then we have agreed on the practical steps and built working relationships among us that endure beyond the symposium, I think we will already have created a momentum and an energy that will sustain us going forward. And on that note, I want to conclude my remarks. I wish you well for the remainder of the symposium. Look forward to spending a little bit of time with you this morning. I'll try and stay a few more minutes and be part of the engagement to follow. Thank you so much, everybody.
So as I was preparing for the symposium, someone told me I should never say ladies and gentlemen. So I'll remember, I'll remember to call you colleagues using inclusive language always, as we do at UWC. I think some of you, if you go to our main hall, you'll see the flags that fly there, and also some of the new initiatives that you may read about. So I don't want to dilute what Prof. Balfour has given us this morning by overly summarizing, but I think the takeaway message, the main message for me is the scholarly should make a change. So as we convene our summer school every year, I think I've heard some people reflecting on the summer school. Some have come up to me and said, "Oh, this was not boring," because we usually expect universities to be boring, spaces of jargon and stuff. But this was quite different. So I think this is what we aspire, particularly also being housed under the PAG that Prof. Anciano mentioned. So you can also check out on our website how we try to bridge the scholarly um, um, world and the real world, so that we don't write our papers and then they gather dust in libraries. We come to society, we collect information, then we write it to our colleagues in language that we can only exchange, and everyone else is left out in society. So and I'm glad that Prof. Balfour sees the Africa Hub as doing stewardship work. And we're not doing any, well, because of funding, there may be need for austerity here and there, but I think overly, I think we trying to use the resources that we have use as best as we can, and then also framing this symposium as an act of protection in itself, because we're here to actually reflect on what the context demands, what are the threats that we're facing, and also the work that we're doing at UWC being exemplary. The way we think of it is that it's exemplary, both exemplary, but also experimental in a way. It's not a finished work on its own. It keeps evolving, keeps changing, and with more exchange of knowledge and learning from what we're doing, we hope to improve and become better and better. And then I think Prof also mentions the shock doctrine as one of the mechanisms, I think, that states use to socially engineer or whatever, or introduce big changes. But we also want to use this shock doctrine in a different way, to try and shock universities into acting. We try to jolt them into acting, which is why we call and invite them in these spaces, things that they may not have thought about being possible on campuses, and then saying, okay, so we can actually host human rights defenders. But this is not going to be easy, because as universities are repoliticized, some of them become those spaces, they will obviously face the backlash of the state. They will obviously face probably more tighter, restrictions because of those things. But I don't want to stray further into summarizing and misrepresenting Prof. I'd like to call upon the first panel to come forward. I would like to call upon Prof. Paul Grady, Prof. Sarojini Nada, and Gloria Kimani to take their seats up front. As they take their seats up front, can I just make these few remarks of saying, reminding ourselves that, as Prof rightly said, that universities have occupied this ambivalent position, where they function in some spaces, as spaces for reform, for resistance and refuge, but in others as spaces of constraint. And then at this right moment, they are being called upon to respond to the shrinking space, civic space, and the democratic regression. You may use different terms. Some are calling it democratic backsliding, and others. We are not imposing any frame of, the language that we can use to describe what's happening. But most importantly, I think, as Prof. Balfour also said, this symposium is not emerging in isolation. This is continuous work. And also Prof. Anciano mentioned the 2023, in this very room that you're sitting today, about 60 people or so were sitting here. And out of that emerged the Africa Hub, but also we acknowledge also other things that have been happening out there in the world to try and bridge the gap between civil society and universities to act in the current moment. Importantly, this work has not been about presenting universities as ready-made protective spaces. Rather, it's been about learning from practice, about how universities show up in relation to human rights work, sometimes as allies, as conveners, sometimes as cautious, constrained institutions, often as contested spaces, negotiating risk, responsibility, and institutional limits. So our panel, the first panel, we want to deepen and also take the baton from our Vice Chancellor to try and have a reflective conversation about how universities and other knowledge institutions are engaging together with civil society within shifting global conditions affecting democracy, civic space, and human rights. Without much ado, I would like to introduce my panelists who feel like they're a mile away from me. But I'll be joining you shortly. And because this is a panel, so we'll have between 10 and 15-minute input from each of them. And then I'll probably ask them maybe one first round of questions and then open it up to you, colleagues. I almost said, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, so I think the first speaker in no particular order, we have Prof. Paul Grady, the only gentleman. Okay, and I'm getting into that language. Okay, the one sitting closest to me, Prof. Grady is the director of the Center for Applied Human Rights at the University of York. He also holds the UNESCO Chair, I think as it's been said by Prof. Anciano and Prof. Balfour. So at CAR, the Center for Human Rights, Applied Human Rights, he leads two strands of work of one, teaching, which draws from the Center's Protective Fellowship scheme for human rights defenders, which been run, I think, for over 15 years now. They celebrated their 15th year in 2024. And then the other part, which is research and activism, places CAR at the heart of York as the human rights city in the UK. Prof. Grady is also the co-editor of the Journal of Human Rights Practice, which he helped establish in 2007. So we hope to draw from his experiences and on how we can rethink and reimagine universities. Like I said, we are both acting and reflecting, so we're trying to be critical as we act. So the fact that he's hosting a protective fellowship doesn't mean it's a finished product. So we expect him to also be critical of those things. And then we have Prof. Sarojini Nada, who is sitting the furthest from me. If you could just wave. So she's our second panelist. Prof. Nada is a theologian and biblical scholar and the Desmond Tutu Research Chair in Religion and Social Justice here at the University of the Western Cape. Prof. Nada's work has long engaged questions of ethics, power, and public responsibility. Her numerous publications span the diverse topics of research at intersections of gender studies, religion, and more recently, gender in higher education. Prof. Nada sits on 5 international journal editorial boards, including some on feminist studies and religion. She brings a thoughtful institutional perspective from within the university to this panel, grounded in sustained engagement with social justice and public scholarship. So we hope to tap from that rich research experience and just your appreciation of today, the global context at the moment. And then our last speaker, not least, is the one seated in the middle. Could you wave, ma'am? So Miss Gloria Kimani is a human rights defender and lawyer from Kenya. She has been at the forefront of defending protesters, particularly during the Gen Z protests in Kenya. I think most of us, if not all of us, would have seen that. And she went into some of the police stations to actually get some who had been arrested to be released. So she was an activist by accident. She wasn't an activist before then, so she was just a lawyer going about her business, and then she she found herself in the thick of things because of the Gen Z. So I think we thank the Gen Z for producing one of the HRDs. And then her work extends beyond Kenya now. Now she works through that region, particularly Tanzania and Uganda. Gloria is an alumni of our inaugural African Universities Hub Fellowship in 2024. We hope this has something to do with, that recently she was recognized by the Business Daily in Kenya as the top 40 under 40, as part of the top 40 under 40 women in Kenya in 2025. We credit ourselves as we have. So honoring her courage and leadership during challenging times. So to this panel, Gloria brings the lived experience of what it means, for universities to act, but also she brings the lived experiences of being a human rights defender, particularly in East Africa, to help us reflect and rethink, moving forward, what are some of the key roles that universities can play? And then in terms of how we are going to roll, we're just going to start with Paul, and then followed by Prof. Sarojini, and then Gloria, and then we take it from there. Paul, I would like to welcome you on stage. Please clap hands for the first panelist.
Thanks, Melly. Also, my thanks to Neo, Fiona, and the whole team here at UWC for organizing this event. It's an honor to be here, and indeed, I'm humbled to be here, as I think are many of the rest of us, to hear about the kind of activities that the African Universities Hub has been conducting over the last 2.5 years, and just the extraordinary way in which it's taken off. It clearly was an idea whose time had come, and the work, you'll hear more about it over the next few days, but has really expanded into something extremely significant, I think. So a number of speakers have already alluded to the fact that the global context that we face is an extraordinarily challenging one. It needs to be said. I'm not going to dwell on it overly, but I think it's worth stressing perhaps two main challenges that both universities and civil society have faced in recent years, and in some cases for decades. And one is the issue of austerity and budget cuts, which I think has become perhaps particularly acute in recent years. And added to that, the philanthropic world is undergoing massive changes at the moment in terms of pots of money shrinking, money being redirected to different areas and so on, creating an enormous amount of uncertainty. And then the uptick in populist and authoritarian government has added a kind of political crisis to an existing set of economic crises. And in saying that, it's also important to acknowledge that there are parts of the world that have never enjoyed very much civic space. The idea of shrinking civic space is something we talk about a lot, but it's important, I think, to both acknowledge and learn from those places where, frankly, there's never been much in the way of civic space or democracy. So while I think we have to face the challenges and be honest about them over the next 2 days, they are significant and potentially fairly long-lasting. We also, as speakers have already alluded to, need to think about responses. And I think we need to be both innovative and courageous in the way in which we do so. And I guess at the heart of this event and the kind of work that we do at our center, and I think PUG and the Hub here are also trying to do, is to try and make the case that universities and civil societies are natural allies in doing this kind of work. We both have a vested interest in a vibrant public sphere and the socio-economic conditions that underpin such a sphere. We both benefit from and surely should advocate for what we broadly call democratic values. And the kind of borders between universities and civil society are often very porous. And in some of the international work that we've done, we've had people, for example, coming from Latin America saying, we don't really make this distinction between academics and scholars. So there are scholar activists, there are student activists. We've heard about Gen Z already, perhaps going in one direction. We also have community activists and others who move onto campus, collaborating in teaching and research and so on. So I think, as we'll discuss over the next 2 days, the links between universities and civil society is very diverse. I'm going to talk a little bit about protection and the concept of protection, which again has already been picked up. And you'll probably hear this term, an ecosystem of protection. And I guess part of what we're trying to understand there is the different roles that civil society and universities can play in collaborating to protect activists and frontline practitioners. And that I guess it is important to say that while we're natural allies, that universities are not the same as NGOs. There are differences. And it's also important to understand what those differences are. As I'm sure a lot of you know, the language around almost everything here can be contested, protection, human rights defender, and so on. We could spend 2 days discussing the correct vocabulary. Please, can I suggest we don't? We'll find over time, I think, an emerging set of terms and vocabularies that work, and they may be different in different contexts. So the centre where I'm based in York has, for actually now almost the best part of 20 years, hosted a protective fellowship scheme for human rights defenders at risk. So not scholars at risk, not students at risk, but for frontline human rights activists. And we've hosted over 120 people from over 50 countries who come for between 3 and 6 months. So not linked to a degree program, but as a kind of separate educational opportunity. And it's been a completely open program in terms of geography and the issues that the defenders can be working on. And like many of these protective schemes, they have arisen out of a context of increased risk for those doing human rights work and an acknowledgement that sometimes temporary respite is necessary and can be provided by a range of different actors. A lot of it's provided by NGOs, but universities can also play a role. And the function of temporary relocation is a period to step back, to have some respite, to do training if there are any training gaps that can be filled, to do some networking and so on. So there's a similarity to a lot of what's offered on these programs. But I think over time, we've reflected on the fact that we're a global North university that has developed some expertise in this area, but is very much part of an ecosystem and faced up to the question, to put it very directly, why would a defender at risk from Mozambique or from Libya or from Senegal necessarily be best placed coming to York? Wouldn't it be better if there was a more local university or a group of universities and other support structures who could support those defenders closer to home? So we developed a UNESCO Chair application where we had 2 branches to it. One was to develop or to explore the idea of developing hubs that might do protection work within universities in other parts of the world. And the second was to develop a set of guidelines that would help universities in thinking through some of the things that you need to think through before you start, but also when you're running the program. And UWC's work, I've been trying to think of a way of stating this where it's absolutely clear that it's not something that in a sense we initiated. The UWC's work, we have accompanied, we've supported and walked alongside an initiative at UWC which has taken off in its own right. And as I've said, gone on to do extraordinary work, hosting fellows, summer school, and so on. And responding to a demand from a meeting in 2023 where defenders on the continent of Africa wanted not just protection mechanisms within the continent, but also knowledge, that the knowledge around civic space, civil society, protection, and so on, they often felt they had to go elsewhere for, and they wanted that kind of knowledge to be more routinely created within the continent. And we have people today from Asia and from Latin America who are thinking through doing similar work. So one of the pleasures of an event like this is that you can already start to see the different ways in which knowledge is being exchanged, right? We're all here to learn from UWC. In 2 or 3 years' time, we may be in Mahidol, in Bangkok, or in Mexico, learning from somewhere else. And in each place, these schemes will need to be contextualized and adapted to the context in which they're based. Okay, how long do I have?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm gonna end with 3 questions. The first is, who are we protecting? Are we going to work with the definition of human rights defenders? Do we include student activists and scholar activists as human rights defenders? And if so, what implication does that have for the schemes? Can universities address the needs of grassroots activists? Is it realistic that people who may not have an undergraduate degree, may not have full tertiary education, secondary education, can be absorbed into a university? What are the implications? What level of risk? And I think there's another set of questions about what we're doing has to be about more than protecting people. These schemes are for individuals, so how do we expand the benefits from individuals to movements, organizations, communities? And how do we make sure that the protection of people is also a protection of values and a protection of different kinds of knowledge? We can bring defenders into the university and say, we discount, we're not interested in your knowledge, here's the textbook. Or we can bring activists into the classroom and embrace and celebrate their knowledge as conveyors of knowledge, as a way of decolonizing knowledge, if you like. They're 2 very different ways of working. So that's the first set of questions. I guess the second set of questions, again, has been alluded to, is what kind of universities do we want to be a part of? What do we want our universities to be and to do? And I guess I'm not interested so much, I don't think it's as relevant at a kind of macro level, but from the place that you all occupy, those of you based in universities, the spaces where you are based, what is possible in relation to addressing societal challenges, in relation to addressing global issues? What are the spaces that exist within your university, even if it's a difficult and constrained environment in other ways, where you can collaborate and express solidarity with civil society? What are those spaces? And then the third question is, picking up on, I think, something that Fiona said, is how do we work together? We are different universities and civil society groups, but obviously part of what we want from this event is some sense of how that would happen across the African continent, involving more universities with UWC, but also a bigger range of civil society partners, but also in time, the potential for a global network of universities working together, obviously, again, with civil society. What are the modalities? How do we work together in a way that we get the best out of our mutual strengths? And my final comment, I promise, Melis, my final one, is I want to invite you to spend the next 2 days to dream. I think when things are as challenging as they are at the moment, that can seem difficult, but actually I think being able to dream and having a space like this to dream and to be ambitious is more necessary now than perhaps it ever has been. But again, coming back to something that Fiona says, we need to dream, but I think we also need to anchor our dreams. I think at the end of this, we do need to leave with a call for action, a program for action, clarity about a way forward, whereby in 3 years' time, we can look back at this from where it may be, somewhere in Africa, Mexico, Thailand, and think, wow, look at what we've done over the last 3 years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. I will not walk over there. I suppose I'm not too tall when I'm, and maybe I'll just sit. Okay. I'll not try to summarize most of what Paul said. I think the comments were quite clear. Um, except the mention of 2023. I've been looking at some of the activists that were there in 2023 that they will probably start evaluating the HAP and saying, oh, but we didn't say they should do this. But I suppose there will be some happiness around what has been achieved. But as Paul rightly say, I think we want to be more ambitious, to dream what are the next steps, and then also walk away with a program of action. And the three or four questions I think that he has posed: um, protection of people, protection of knowledge, protection of values. In most cases, universities tend to think, knowledge there is a certain type of knowledge that's acceptable, and then so I think what we're also trying to do is to decolonize it, as I think you're saying. And then what can we do as universities? What are the spaces that are there? How can we work together with civil society? And then the dreaming part. Thank you so much for your inputs. I would like to now call upon Prof. Sarojini to give us her views. Please clap hands for our next speaker.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Melly and Fiona, for this opportunity. I'm very much an outsider to the what I see is an insider conversation happening about the relationship between UWC and York, and so I suppose I'm going to offer some reflections simply from where I am, which is what I've been asked to do. I'm a little bit weak in my knees. There's been a bug going around in Cape Town, a tummy bug, and I wasn't quite sure whether I was going to make it this morning, but I'm here, so I hope that my thoughts will be coherent. So when I was thinking about how to approach this topic today, how to say something meaningful in 10 to 15 minutes about universities, democracy, and the protection of human rights defenders, I found myself going back on an experience a little bit earlier in my career, almost just I think a little bit more than a decade ago now, when I was at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and I headed up a program there called Gender, Religion, and Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights. The program was funded by a Swedish development agency, and it focused on the intersections of gender, religion, and sexual and reproductive health and rights. The premise of the program was quite straightforward, right? It basically said that maternal mortality, access to contraception, the rights of sexual minorities were all deeply shaped by religious authority and by cultural norms. And therefore, if one wished to address sexual and reproductive health inequalities meaningfully, one could not ignore the role of religion and the role of culture. So the aim of the program was to train master students to conduct rigorous critical research at these intersections, to interrogate the theological, the cultural, and political structures that shaped access to health and rights. Now, that's quite a noble intention, I think. So we built this program quite carefully. It required epistemological work, not just administrative work. We had to persuade colleagues that the study of religion and theology belonged in a conversation with public health, that gender theory had something to say to epidemiology, that a master's student could and should analyze both a policy document and a sermon with equal intellectual seriousness. So it was slow and often contested work. But over time, we began to graduate close to 10 master's students a year, each working on research that complicated neat development narratives and asked difficult questions about culture, about power, and about beliefs. Now, at the end of the first cycle of the program, I, as the director of the program, had to meet with a consultant from the donor agency. So I presented our curriculum, our research outputs, the theoretical frameworks our students were engaging, and we spoke about how they were learning to navigate religious authority critically and constructively. And after listening to me for some time, the consultant leaned forward and asked, she said, "All of this is very impressive, but tell us, how many mothers and children have you saved through this program?" And in that moment, I did not know how to respond. I remember the slight tightening of my chest, the awareness that the question was sincere, even generous in intent, but somehow misplaced. And as an aside, later a colleague working at Stellenbosch University was running a parallel program, told me that she had been asked the same question. And she said she stared for a moment and then, in a mixture of panic and irony, lifted her hand and said, 5. Now, we still laugh about that, but the humor does not erase what the question exposed. As a university, as Paul said, and our rector reflected on, we are not NGOs, right? And that distinction matters. Not because NGOs and civic organizations do less serious work, of course not, but because they do different work. Universities are not emergency rooms. We are not mobile clinics. We do not distribute medication or run vaccination campaigns. We produce knowledge. We cultivate analytical capacity, and we train scholars to ask, at least in this program, how vulnerability is structured and how religious authority operates, and of course, how theological beliefs and cultural norms can travel into policy documents. Our work was really visible in the short term. And so this brings me to the first point, and I only have 3 points that I want us to consider in the context of the symposium and the guidelines which I presume are being launched here, right? If universities begin to understand themselves primarily through the language of deliverables and impact metrics, then I think that something fundamental shifts. The university gets repositioned from a site of knowledge production to a site of implementation, from a space of critical interrogation to a space of service delivery. And in such a configuration, our legitimacy depends on demonstrating quantifiable results rather than on sustaining critical inquiry. And I think when that happens, the defense of democracy and the protection of human rights defenders becomes vulnerable to the same logic. Protection risks becoming a program, God forbid, an office, a protocol, a measurable output, rather than an expression of the university's intellectual vocation. And the university's unbound paper that was in our packet, I think, presents to us a wonderful conversation in that it reminds us that universities have historically functioned not only as transmitters of knowledge, but as spaces of contestation and refuge. They have sheltered dissident thought and offered intellectual hospitality in times of democratic crisis. But that role cannot be sustained if the university understands itself merely as an instrument of development. So the donor's question revealed an assumption that knowledge must demonstrate immediate, measurable impact. And as I say, when universities begin to understand themselves primarily through deliverables and metrics, I think it narrows our intellectual vocation. So the question that we must ask is, what happens when that happens? What happens when the expectation that the value of knowledge lies in its measurable immediate impact? What happens? What do we do with this expectation? Because we cannot forget that our fundamental role is distinguished from the NGOs, as I've said. I think also one of the issues is that within this framework, when we see ourselves as delivering, just metrics and outputs, etc., particularly in the global south, universities then get positioned as implementers rather than as theorists. We are expected to provide the raw data, the community access, the case studies, and measurable outputs, rather than to define the terms of the debates on human rights and democracy. And I imagine that this is something that would need to be taken up in the discussion about the partnership between a global north and global south institution. And so my first thought is that we must protect the university's intellectual and scholarly role in the subject. Secondly, the conversation with this donor and the consultant revealed something else that was important, I think, for us to consider here today, too. And that is, what are our assumptions about human rights and its universality? Now, I know, Paul, you said, let's not get bogged down in the vocabulary. But I do think that the donor's question revealed assumptions about what counts as a human rights outcome, right? The saving of mothers and children, rightly urgent, was treated as the primary metric of success. But also implicit in the discussion was that human rights discourses are universal and that they are self-evident. But universality is produced. It is shaped by geopolitical power and by historical memory. Our students in this program were doing work that actively questioned those assumptions. Some of these questions even questioned our own feminist assumptions as teachers on the program. For example, one student in her master's work critically interrogated the idea of female genital mutilation, as it is termed in the literature, versus the notion of cutting, and how this is interpreted differently in different cultural contexts. Now, of course, I don't have time to go into that debate about whether it's mutilation or cutting, but I think that the point here is that universities have a crucial responsibility, not only to defend human rights defenders, but to interrogate the very categories of human rights and democracy that shape global discourse. And we see this particularly in the current global rhetoric in the current moment. For example, Israel is repeatedly described as the only democracy in the Middle East, right? We hear this all the time, a phrase that confers moral legitimacy and structures the interpretation of the genocide in Gaza. We hear claims that queer people would be killed in Palestine, as though that assertion resolves complex questions of occupation and of state violence and about apartheid. We recall, too, how, for example, the United States framed its intervention in Afghanistan as a project of saving oppressed women, right? Mobilizing the language of women's rights and feminist activism to justify military action in Afghanistan. In each of these instances, human rights language is selectively mobilized. It becomes part of geopolitical narratives. It allocates legitimacy unevenly. It risks becoming a tool of power rather than solely a challenge to it. So universities have a crucial responsibility, as I said, to interrogate those very categories of human rights and democracy that shape global discourse. Because I suppose the question is, are we simply custodians of established human rights frameworks, or are we intellectual spaces where the very meaning, limits, and politics of those frameworks are interrogated? Because if we treat human rights and democracy as settled categories, we relinquish one of the university's most vital roles, the work of critique. And so I would invite us to actually interrogate those categories. And the final question inevitably, I think, leads to a third, and that is, what kind of institutional courage is required for universities to defend human rights and democracy when scholarship itself becomes politically unsettling? And so when knowledge challenges dominant narratives, right, as those who are working at the intersections of human rights and our disciplines will tell us, when it challenges dominant narratives, it provokes discomfort. It invites contestation. It generates pressure. And I have personally seen how quickly conversations about scholarship shift into conversations about risk. My book, Gender, Genocide, Gaza, has taught me this lesson in quite personal ways in the last year. The book was released last May, and I was invited to give a series of lectures at King's College London in May last year. And before I could even arrive at King's College, I was told that there's a lot of political sensitivity, there's going to be heightened security concerns. There was even a question about whether the lectures would continue. So the invitation to speak became entangled in anxieties about protest. And I think that these moments are symptomatic of a broader contraction in the democratic space. The concept note for the symposium calls democratic backsliding. And so we must ask ourselves, are universities prepared to sustain scholarship that unsettles power, even when doing so complicates institutional comfort? Because protecting human rights defenders is not only about offering affiliation, offering visas, or institutional shelter. It is about cultivating cultures of thought that do not retreat into the first sign of contestation. It is about recognizing that democracy depends not on the absence of disagreement, but on the presence of spaces where disagreement can be sustained. And perhaps this is where the story that I began with about my experience with the donor and the consultant returns most perceptibly, right? The donor's question, how many mothers and children have you saved, was not wrong, but it was incomplete. It could not account for the slower, the quieter work of intellectual transformation. It could not capture the role of universities in reshaping how rights are understood, how power is analyzed, and how justice is reimagined. Which leaves us finally with the deeper question beneath all of this. What are universities for, if not to cultivate the intellectual conditions under which democracy and human dignity can be thought, contested, and defended? The guidelines you're launching today matter precisely because they recognize that universities are part of a broader civic ecosystem. But guidelines alone cannot carry this work. What sustains it is an intellectual culture, one that resists the instrumentalization, how many mothers and children have been saved, that one that interrogates the universality of human rights, and one that is willing to inhabit the discomfort of critical thought. If we can hold on to that, then universities, I think, will remain what they have sometimes at their best been, that is, not neutral spaces above politics, but necessary spaces within it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we benefit a lot from inviting outsiders if Prof. Sarojini calls herself an outsider, then certainly we need more of those. I think you can see from her inputs. I guess when she characterizes herself as an outsider, it raises a lot of questions whether do we have to extend the tent? Do we have to just live with the fact that there will always be outsiders and the outsiders should come and disrupt the way we think? And in our spaces, we constantly need that jolt of saying, okay, we're counting 6 fellows, 9 fellows produced, but are we balancing that with the intellectual, I think, role that the university should play? I think you raise very critical questions about that. And then also, I know there are some of our donors in the room that want to count how many fellows we've hosted and stuff. So I think where we are trying to move to is, can we hold these together in a more balanced way where we actually act, but we also think? So we have spaces for both thinking and action. I think, as Paul said, that we need, I think from his experience and the way he was speaking, it shows that we can certainly balance both, and how we can learn from these experiences to then, interrogate the frameworks and the thinking around human rights, as you put it. So yes, we have helped 9 fellows so far, and still counting. But also, are we disrupting? Are we thinking? Are we shifting the debates around, what protection is, what human rights are, and what democracy is? Is it backsliding? Is it retreating? Is it what? Contexts are different and stuff. So not taking all these usually global north framed framing of what the problem is, with trying to disrupt that and also introduce decolonial thinking. I wouldn't go further into what you've said. I think participants, I saw lots of people taking notes, and you will get the opportunity to ask questions. I'd like to, at this point, call upon our last speaker for this panel, Gloria Kimani, to give us her inputs in the next 10 to 15 minutes, and then we open it up for plenary. Gloria, please, let's welcome her.
Good morning, comrades. Good morning, comrades. Now, because we are being told to use gender-sensitive language, I was told comrades is the best because a comrade is just a comrade, and you will not be quoted anywhere to be gender insensitive. So I think, Melly, you can, I hear they call you Dr. Dube, so I think you can adapt that. I will be here speaking. I quite felt intimidated when I was asked by Dr. Melly to actually do this, because I was thinking, this panel must have a lot of professors, but what they don't have is my experience as a HRD. As a HRD, actually, who has benefited from a university program. And Melly was right. I did not know that I was a HRD until some people came to Kenya and they saw the kind of work I'm doing, and they asked me, what do you think you're doing? I'm like, I took an oath to protect the Constitution, and I think I was working as a lawyer. I did not know I was phrased a HRD. And some of these times you find the people that you protect, especially those in the grassroots, do not actually think they are HRDs, but actually they are doing the work which is needed in the society. So I was asked to, when I was given the question of rethinking and reimagining the role of universities and other knowledge institutions in defending the democracy and protecting the human rights defenders, it came to mind, what would other human rights defenders do who have benefited from other programs? And I love that we're in a space where we have the universities who are hosting these human rights defenders. And we have, in this room, we have the donors who come and actually support these programs. And in this place, we have still the civil societies who actually network with these human rights defenders into making our society better. So what do universities do? They provide a safe space for human rights defenders at risk or not so much at risk to express academic freedom, rest respite, and to continue doing the work. So universities are supposed to provide a space for dialogue, which has sadly diminished. I'm looking from it at an East African angle, and also maybe from a Southern African, and just in general. We are talking about where universities were places where dialogues could happen about politics, about what is happening in the society. But these days we do not find the universities, or I'm not saying this university per se, but in general, I'm talking about the universities in Africa mostly. And we find that before, when we had colonialism or even post-colonialism, where student activism was really in the universities, but right now we do not find our students in the universities, and the university role in actually creating human rights defenders, it has quite diminished. And this is a conversation that we need to talk about, not only in protecting human rights defenders, but also creating an avenue where we have a rise of human rights defenders and activists in the space. Before, we had universities actually coming in and protecting political exiles. This is a question that we need to come back and ask ourselves. Most of the time, I remember in Kenya, the time we were still under the colonial government, most of our leaders were hosted in Europe, in the universities in Europe, where they got to network with other Pan-Africanists. They got to network with other people of like minds. But right now, do we have universities actually coming in and protecting political exilees who have taken a stand on their political view? Definitely, I'm talking about people who are taking a political view in line of what we are talking about in human rights. There are people who really do not protect or uphold the rule of law or human rights. But there are politicians out there who actually speak our language. But because we are in the civil society and we would like to tend to be apolitical, but these are our allies. One way or another, these people will be leaders. And if we do not support them and put them in places where they are safe at the moment to discuss politics, and in that, human rights is not different from politics. It's one and the same thing. So I think it's very important that we do give these people the human rights, although they have taken a political stand. We usually say that we do not discriminate, but when it comes to people who have taken a political stand, we actually do discriminate. And that is not our place as human rights defenders to discriminate, even if we're talking about their political rights. What should universities do? Create ad hoc programs for maybe emergency human rights defenders who are at risk, or programs that will actually develop the human rights defender in this case. And most of the time, maybe when we are having programs, we do not think that at times it's good even for the human rights defender in the kind of work that they're doing to have a degree. And it is true that Professor had once said, what about the grassroots human rights defender who does not have a degree? How do we show up especially when they come into our universities, how do we actually show that they were here and they did something and it goes to their CV? And even if they're looking for a job or something, they can say they had a training on such and such a kind of thing. So I think it's important that we look into the sustainability of it and have programs even for grassroots human rights defenders or other human rights defenders in this kind of when we are actually hosting them for a time being. We also have short, most of the time when we have these programs, it might not be sufficient time and it's on a case-to-case basis. I'm not saying all human rights defenders, but this is on a case-to-case basis where one cannot go to the country after 5 to 3 months or 6 months. Is it time we start rethinking of the time the program provides, and on a case-to-case basis, can we hold the human rights defender longer than that, where they can still do their work, where they can contribute even to the host university, and have a space even when going back to their country, they can still be able to go back to their country. And if it's not possible for them to go back to their country, are we going to release them just because our funding is not there? Are they still going to be at risk? those are questions that we need to ask. And the people in this room, I do not have the answers, but I believe we are going to have the answers for that. We also need to think of the long-term plan of the human rights defender. At times, as I said, when this program is over and maybe they were at risk and they came to our universities, what happens to them, especially when they're in their universities? They left, maybe they were providing for kids at home, or they had a family. Yes, it's true that we have solved one problem, they're out of risk. But what happens to their mental health? Do they have to think that I need to provide at home? Are they, even as we are providing a safe space for them, are they there with you just because they are physically safe? Are they mentally, psychologically safe? Are their families safe? So those are things that maybe we need to think about even as we advance the protection of human rights defenders. And in this, I think we need to rethink on how we protect them. At times, we do offer them the support that is needed on the need basis, but we do not think about their sustainability after that. Can we think, when a human rights defender is in our programs, ways that they can earn and support their work? Because some of these people do their work alone. There's nobody to support their work. So can we think of ways we can equip them in for them to earn? And also, after they have left our programs, are they going to be seeking for support from us? I think there are things that we do not have in our programs, but I think we need to think about sustainability of our work ourselves and also of the human rights defenders that we do protect. We have also had a problem of professionals in the human rights space. We have medics, we have engineers, we have architects. If we were to bring a medic to you, Melly, would you know what to do with them and the university as right now if you were to bring them in this program? So I think it's good that we start collaborating. There are people who accidentally, as you have heard of my story, we accidentally became human rights defenders by the work that we are simply doing. What happens to people who are not in the legal space, people who are not in the political space, that they can fall within our programs, but we can support them to actually do their work and feel that they have impacted the society. So we need to actually partner with other professional bodies and other civil societies to see how we can bring in not only the people who are vocal, but also even artists in these spaces. How do we, if we bring people who maybe are not academically inclined, but they still want to continue and they still want to be hosted in the university, how do we support all of them? So in this, we call to action that we create programs and not just temporary programs. I think here I will be speaking to the donors. We think we need to think of a way of sustaining the programs that we have. And in a way of sustaining it, we also as a university or people defending human rights defenders, not only thinking of the donor aspect, but how do we as institutions create avenues of income to actually support the work, that if donors do not come through, human rights defenders are protected everywhere. We need to think of professional progression of human rights defenders, even as we host them. Are we going to equip them or they're just there for safety? And I think it's quite important that we do equip human rights defenders in their work. And support going beyond the 3 months, 6 months, especially for human rights defenders at risk. How do we come and protect them? And some of them maybe will never have a chance of going back home. How do we protect them? So, and I think lastly is partner with civil societies and professional bodies for the non-conventional human rights defenders. Thank you.
I think for the sake of freeing the mics, I'll come here and then prepare for our Q&A. But before we do that, I just want to thank my panelists and then also thank Gloria for reflecting on, you know, What is a human rights defender? I think this is both a practical question, but also a very theoretical or even philosophical question, if you like. And then universities challenging ourselves, challenging us in terms of what universities can do, providing spaces for dialogue. You know, again, I think Gloria, in thinking about what a human rights defender is, challenges us to see who is our allies, who is not traditionally defined as a human rights defender, but they are actually a human rights defender. For instance, political activists, I think, that are normally and usually, because of the frameworks that we work in sometimes, sometimes donor institutions are an extension, or donor programs are an extension of their country's foreign policy. So if there is no appetite for you know, this appetite of, we don't want to intervene in other countries' affairs and stuff. So the idea is to, let's keep with civil society. Let's not, work with political human rights defenders or politicians defining them as human rights defenders. And then I think she emphasizes the need for flexibility within universities, I think, in our programs. So now I'll move to Q&A session. I think we have about 20 minutes to do that. Q&A. We'll have roving mics, one on this side of the room and then the other on this side of the room. I see 2 hands that side. Yes, now we can go ahead.
Right. Thank you very much. My name is Fidelis. I'm Protection Coordinator for East and Southern Africa with Frontline Defenders. As Gloria was speaking, I just began to think of some of the experiences we've had with this, with the fellowship, with the fellowship here. This kind of protection work, bringing in human rights defenders. I also refer to the suggestion that you're going to be pulled into service, because this work doesn't just come in and be in the safe space you're provided. It draws you as well as an institution to share with some of the traumas that were being shared by Gloria, and I'm sure that have been shared with particularly in the team. And the universities often are not quite prepared about what it means to provide someone with a safe space. You are providing them with a safe space to open up to the traumas that they've been suppressing in their communities. So what may appear to be a safe space will be actually a place where they are able to open up, and some of the stresses manifest in there. And this is often where it creates problems if people are not ready, because where there's safe space, that's when the problems come out, because people now feel safe enough to go through the whole experience. And I'm not saying the program is bad, but it also provides an opportunity for almost a sterile environment for you to intervene. But how to intervene? The interventions have got to be holistic, because a person is not going to come about their physical safety, about their food. They're going to come about their mental safety, their legal problems, and that is all going to, because you are the safe space at that time, it's all going to be lodged on the universities. And sometimes in the beginning, the person in safety may actually suffer a little bit more when they've got time and the place to start thinking and to relive some of the things that they've gone through. So it's a very huge undertaking and there's, I think probably the universities realize there's need to involve a whole lot of other professionals. I think that was a very quiet ask from Gloria, that what would you do if a medical person were to come in? So there's all those preparations that we've got, and all those emergencies that will come up that we've got to think about. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I'll encourage our speakers to just keep it short so that we have as many inputs as possible.
Thank you, Meli, and thank you, the panel. My name is Salome Nduta from Kenya. Thank you, Gloria, for bringing our voices on the table. I have 2 questions and comments. One is, what kind of relationship are universities planning to develop or even envisioning with this kind of program? Because defenders will come with expectations. Do we end our relationship after 3 or 6 months, or do we anticipate a relationship that is that is going to develop? My second question is, how do we harvest what Prof is calling deliverables after the program? And I'm saying this because I know one of the women defenders in Kenya who did a very good research that has developed something on wellness and well-being after her stay at York University. I know one of the 9 who has come back home doing things differently from the way he was doing. So how are universities going to harvest the deliverables that emerge out of this program? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Can we shift to this side of the room? I see 2 hands, 3 hands as well. Silisa.
Good morning. My name is Longandweni. I am from Equal Education. I'm also a student here at UWC. Gloria talked about student activism, and she touched me very much as a student activist myself, and how there's, I think, a lack of student activism in our universities. And I think that is largely due to the persecution of student activists by many universities, including this one, in that most universities don't seem to accept student activists and student activism. They only accept it when it does not disrupt the normal course of university activities. And when there's a slight sniff of disruption, universities tend to then brutalize and prosecute students. So I think my question then is, how do we ensure that universities recognize student activists as human rights defenders and treat them as such, instead of, disruptors and outcasts who only seem to cause chaos in universities? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I think we'll take 2 more and then we get responses.
Thank you very much. My name is Josephine Dagire from Makerere University School of Law. There's so much to think about and to reflect on, but I would like to highlight 1 or 2 areas that I think are very important for us to think about. The first is that when we think about, or when we conceptualize or talk about a university, we are sort of thinking that an entire university, for example, UWC, has a role, but I think you're talking about specific units within a university, and these tend to be the School of Law and perhaps maybe some other specialized units in the humanities. Now, that having been said, taking from our own example at the School of Law, Makerere University, there is an assault on not just individual human rights practitioners, but the entire school. And so, which brings me to something very important, and which I hope, taking from Professor Grady's remark on knowledge exchange, how do you, or how can universities defend themselves, or how can these units defend themselves? Because we've reached a point where it's unsafe to publish on human rights. There's a big backlash. You're seen as opposition aligned. So in sum, I'm saying, instead of, or in addition to thinking about the role of universities in protecting HRDs outside, how can these units within universities hold the line and defend themselves, taking, from what others are doing in other spaces? Thank you.
Okay, I promise to take 1 more and then we go back to the speakers.
Thank you. My name is Kwajo Appiah, School of Law, University of Ghana, and then Regional Director of Africa Coalition for Academic Freedom. The issue of sustainability for giving a hub for HRDs, I think, is very important. And my organization, Africa Coalition for Academic Freedom, is even looking at it outside the continent, where some scholars are given the opportunity of protection as a result of what they do within their countries. But when they seek refuge outside, their scholarships or their funding support runs out and they are forced to find other means of sustaining themselves, which takes them out of academia and also takes them out of the activist work that they were doing. And so there should be a way where we can, help these activists, scholars or scholar activists to be able to find their way back into academia, find their way back into activism. They don't lose their agency, and they're able to support any kind of human rights, democracy-related activities on the continent, so that that momentum can be sustained. And I also want to refer to a particular project that we are doing with students that will enable them to create hubs within the universities that will promote academic freedom, and they will work within the universities and extend it beyond that space into the public space to also promote democracy in their communities. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll invite our speakers to use the mic to respond. You are free to take any question and reflections from the audience. And I think quite unusual, our Vice Chancellor, you're not bound to react as well to any of the things that you've heard.
I think the question that was directed to me was student activists as human rights defenders. This is quite a thorny discussion to have, and it's actually really true, and we need to have it. We find universities as governments when we are students, when people are students. What happens to human rights defenders when they speak about the governance of the university, the governance of the nation, the governance of something that is just not happening right in the government, is the same way when it comes to students. When students start speaking of what is not happening right in the university, what they're seeing, what needs to be improved, then there's pushback from the universities and the administration of the university, and they are expelled there, because once they actually mobilize their students to actually speak of their rights, it's seen as rebellion and ways. And so the university tends to suppress their freedoms and their rights in that way. And it's true, student activists are human rights defenders because they are fighting for their cause in the time of the university. So I think what they need to do is find a balance of also being in school or also expressing their ways by well organizing and in the legal framework. First, start by making your demands to the school and see how they can be actually, their issues can be addressed, but in the right framework, and express it in a legal way. That's all I can say for now. But I think universities should also support the plight of students when it comes to their rights being actually infringed or threatened.
Can I? Yep. Okay. Thank you. I suppose maybe just linking up with the question about student activists being conceptualized as human rights defenders. I think related to that is also conceptualizing scholars and academics and professors as human rights defenders, because in our own work itself, we can't see our work. For example, I don't see my work as separate from human rights work. So it's not something out there. And so this binary between activism and academics is a false binary. And so we need to, I think, break down that binary both for students and for scholars, because I think scholars and academics face the same kind of scrutiny, if you like, when we present our work. Is this really scholarship, or is it just, are you just an activist? Are you just doing activist work? So even getting our work, our academic work, being recognized as scholarship and not act or and just activism in the way that it's said in a derogatory way, I think is a challenge. And so for both scholars, because when you have professors in the classroom that have a human rights framework, that will also filter to the students, I think. So that's one. And then just the question about harvesting the knowledge that's produced by the example I was raising about the program that we had and the students that we had was to try to convince the donors to see the intellectual work that the students were doing as development. That intellectual work is development. It's not just giving is it Bishop Camero who says, when I give food to the poor, I'm called a saint. When I ask why the poor are poor, I'm called a communist, right? And so it's the same thing. And the students were asking the critical questions. So there's this praise for the charity work, but not for the justice work. And so what I was trying to convince the donors were, look at the research that has been produced here by these students. They are reframing the ways in which we think about these intersections, and you need to start considering that as development, as justice work, rather than only how many people have we fed, how many mothers and children have been saved. So
I'll go through a number of questions quite quickly, if I may. So on the well-being question, I mean, I think that's a very good example of an area where there's been a lot of really excellent shared learning, and both between universities, but also between universities and civil society providers. And so, I mean, most of the schemes that I'm aware of have a range of different options. So not just a kind of psychosocial approach to well-being, but a much more rounded approach. I'm sure there's more we could do, but it is an area which I think has benefited from multi-directional learning. The structure one and defenders feeling alone, I mean, absolutely, it can be very isolating, and again, is one of the reasons why people who are coming to your culturally, linguistically, if it's different, it can feel very, very kind of alien. I guess the one thing I would say about universities is that universities have an annual calendar which provides a structure that is actually quite good for holding defenders, that if they arrive at the same time as student cohorts, for example, and are joining classes with them, then week by week they've got a calendar of events. They've got, there is a structure that's there within the university that can be at least part of what I think can be useful in kind of holding defenders. Because otherwise they go from an incredibly busy life to kind of nothing much happening. And I absolutely get the danger of that. In terms of relationship long term, I mean, really tricky one. I mean, I think all of us grapple with that as a kind of duty of care issue. What is the duty of care? I think we, for example, try and have an alumni network. We do try and stay in touch. We have been involved in campaigns and various other things on defenders if they've been arrested, or things like that. But it's a challenge as the numbers grow. Basically, that's the key thing. Once you've got 100 people, harvesting deliverables. Yeah, I mean, so we interview, I think most schemes interview people maybe 6 months after they've gone back to initially see how they've settled and so on. And we are about to do a piece of work that's looking back much longer, over a decade and more, to kind of see what impact a relatively short period of relocation has had on impact. I'll share very briefly my favorite quants question, which I was once asked, not how many defenders had we hosted, but how many people had they reached in York, for which I decided 500 was a suitably ludicrous and arbitrary number for me to put down, in terms of speaking events and so on. But it quantified, and it meant nothing. It was, I think I probably better stop then.
Yeah. So quantifying impact, I think we see similarities with the 5. Sometimes you're forced to just draw it from the sky. I think, but these are very important conversations. I'll just take one more round of questions. But before I do that, I want to ask Prof. Balfour, I think there's quite a pointed question around students within universities and how they can be protected from sometimes persecution. What is acceptable kind of disruption or protests? I think Sinolo says that there seems to be a level that can be tolerable. And then when it reaches a certain level, then the university potentially comes down with students, if I heard you correctly. But it's an optional response for the questions, and if you want to. Okay. I think we'll just give you the mic. Sorry.
Yes, thanks very much. I mean, we must always recognize that rights exist relative to each other. The right to education is also a fundamental right that students have, the right to association, the right to protest. And when any of those take precedence over another in a way that, for example, can lead to assault or people being threatened, the institution has a responsibility to the whole of its community, not only to a particular group at that moment.
Thank you for accepting me putting you on the spot, Prof. I think we'll just take the last round and then we'll move to T. I see 2 hands this side and 3 this side. So this side is not around. I think Neo will start from that side.
Thank you. I'm Adriano from Mozambique. Well, mine is a small comment. We have had crisis since 2022 in our region due to elections. And what I saw missing is a coordination with universities and preparedness to quickly respond to the crisis. A few examples. When the Mozambique elections were held, we had really a serious attack on HRDs, and some of them, they are senior lecturers from universities who could quickly get out just for rest and respite a bit. And we reached out to a number of universities in the north and in the south, but they are so rigid in terms of wait until the next batch of applications. But you have a real situation now. So we saw this in Mozambique, we saw this in the Tanzania case. So I think there is a great deal of coordination that is needed. Some of the colleagues, they could kind of quickly get a ticket for themselves to get out, but you want to go somewhere. You, as a professor, you don't want to go like you're going to an exile. You want to go to a space where you can have peers, you can exchange. I don't see this. We have these applications in the websites, etc., but there is no quick and rapid response to situations. If we want to help HRDs, to recover from the burnout, we have to be out there, we have to prepare coordination. So this symposium, for instance, it would also be looking back, reflecting on how we were prepared to respond for the Tanzanian crisis, Mozambique crisis, and also to the situation in Uganda a few months ago, etc. So perhaps this sort of thing needs to be looked at. Thank you so much.
This will sound unfair to others participants, but we are running out of time, or we've already run out of time. I would request us to be very brief in our interventions.
Okay, I hear you. Alice Mogoy, Botswana, from the Tunnel of the Botswana Center for Human Rights. Really, really quickly, both comments, or the comments made by both Professor Nada and Professor Grady, I think is how you pronounce your name, Grady, about numbers. We really need to rethink also what I call the log frameology, in which we're all embedded all the time. I don't know what the alternative is. couldn't agree more about the role, the scholarly role of the university needing to be protected, however, in a contextual way, taking into account our socio-political and historical context of reality, which would then help us to rethink the conceptual frameworks which we're using, which are the tools we keep using for protection, for the work which we do as human rights activists, and even questioning that very fundamental notion of universality and whether there are in fact maybe pluriversalities, which we're ignoring. The accepted binary, which you spoke about, how can the university assist us in understanding the scholar activism or the activist scholarship to try and produce those cultures of thought in a decolonized way, to make sure that what we do really does speak to our realities and contributes to change. Thank you.
Okay, I don't think I saw any other hand. This side, there are two more hands. Yes. You were last in the first round, so yeah, we'll start.
Thank you very much. My name is Dennis Chipili. I'm president for the Southern African Students Union. I'm also a 7th-year medical student. So yes, there's a medic person in the house. And what happens when we bring them here? I have two questions. The first question is in relation to Professor's 3 questions that he asked. Who are we protecting? Now, I speak this from a perspective of a student leader in the Southern African region, having a lot of student defenders who have been victimized. And I'm happy Prof here has spoken to the timely response to a point of those students or those lecturers being victimized to a point of help. I want to find out, I received daily reports in the region where student human rights defenders are being victimized, just like my student behind here gave a submission. I really want the panel to make an affirmation. Should universities take a stance in human rights issues? Because I really am having a big challenge, and I'm happy that we have different calibers in this meeting, and I hope vice chancellors and dean of students should listen carefully as you answer to this question. The second question I want to ask, having you presented your facts, is how can universities support student activists? How can universities support students advocating for social justice? Because this is very primary. Now, there's a very thin line between students, activists being victimized and them being protected in universities. We just want to know, as students in the region, how can universities support students advocating for social justice? Thank you.
Thank you. We have one more.
Yes, thank you. I'm Fatima Swats from the Institute for the Healing of Memories, and I think a partner with what do you call it, internships that has been here. Most of them have come onto our retreats in terms of giving respite and giving counseling ongoing. My question really, or my concern here is that there needs to be a relationship, and I think we are beginning to develop and see how it goes between the university and NGOs. And yes, there's a very particular role for NGOs to play. But we also know that the field of NGOs are very contested, and if there's a lack of context or knowledge within NGOs, it becomes very dangerous, or they become problematic, I would say. So and most probably this goes more to in the future, that NGOs too are a site of knowledge production, because we reflect on our practice of how we're doing it, how we can improve it, and so on. But we don't have the luxury of time that universities have, right? So what is the relationship between that? And then in the luxury of time that university does have, how do they, in terms of public education programs, popular education programs, engage with communities, particularly where activists or human rights defenders, whatever we want to call them, are vulnerable, so that they can get buy-in from that communities, because ultimately it's that communities that will protect the human rights defenders, the whatever. The more isolated individuals becomes within their context, the more vulnerable they are, and they can be picked, and no noise will be made. So just in terms of that, how do we see a closer relationship and link being developed in terms of the general protection of human rights work, I would say?
Okay, there will be a lot of group work and a lot of talking, and almost all of us will get lots of chances to speak. May you allow me to just move back to our speakers to give their final remarks, response to these questions, and also your final remarks.
How can universities support students advocating for social justice? Creating a space for dialogues to happen within the universities where when students come together and they are taught of what is social justice, why are we doing it, and why is it needed for students actually to join in advocating for social justice. So I think universities should create a space where dialogues can happen within the school, and also calling the communities affected by this and having a straightforward dialogue on it. Also, universities and especially the administration ensuring that even as students actually participate in activities of advocating for social justice, that they ensure that their education is not distracted, because maybe you might have interference from the government telling you that this student is problematic and we need to maybe discontinue them with the school, but the university actually quite upholding that the right to education is necessary for this student, and they're actually advocating for the rights out there. So I think that's how universities can actually play. And also a question was asked, should universities actually, is it different, should they advocate for human rights? And I think that is important. There was a scenario where the University of Dar es Salaam, where some professors actually talked about what was happening in the university, and they said they were against the enforced disappearances and arbitrary arrests that are happening in the country. And you found that the professor who actually wrote the letter and asked the others to co-sign, who actually convened them, is actually in exile right now because of that letter, where the university took a stance and said that no, actually we do not like what is happening, and we need to protect the rights. And as you said, I think it's quite important that not only individual universities to take a stand, but the whole administration to take a stand on what is happening, not in the university, but in the society surrounding them.
Thank you for understanding the loop, Gloria. So I think we'll go to the next speaker and keeping it short as well.
Okay, I'll keep it very short. I mean, I agree with a lot of the comments being made, and perhaps we can pick that up in the tea time. But just the very poignant question: should universities be a space that protects social justice? And I think this university is a prime example of a university that has answered in the affirmative to that question. It is not by accident that we call ourselves the home of the intellectual left. So we've answered in affirmative to that question. The question then remains is, how does one live out those values? And the question on student activism is at the heart of that. The two pillars of student activism is a free and decolonized university, right? In terms of roads must fall, a decolonized university, that's sort of a no-brainer for universities such as ours, because we are committed to those values, and we can nurture that kind of scholarship in this institution. The other pillar of a free education is one that needs to be interrogated together with government. And the problem is that we have a government that changed our racial policies but didn't change our economic policies. So we don't operate as a socialist government. We don't operate with socialist principles. We operate with hyper-capitalism, and that comes into the university. So that requires the students and administration working together to to actually defend ourselves from the hypercapitalism that has crept into the university and that promotes managerialism and all the harmful matters. But that requires students and university management working together, not against each other.
Thank you.
Thanks. So the emergency response, I mean, absolutely as a need. I think one of the challenges for universities is that they're big, slow, bureaucratic institutions that are not actually very well suited to emergency response. But I mean, I think one of the interesting things that could come out of a network of universities is to think a little bit more about that, and also to think a bit more about being proactive. One of the problems with the concept of protection, to ignore my own advice earlier on, is that it often feels reactive, right? And slightly patronizing in some ways. So is there something that's a little bit more proactive that could be done that is anticipating the need for emergency responses, maybe not necessarily in specific places, but has a kind of shared collective capacity to do something that could be seen as an emergency response? The knowledge production from within NGOs, absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of us who work with civil society partners do so precisely on that basis, really, an acknowledgement of the kinds of knowledge that are produced and trying to kind of, I guess, co-create research from the beginning with partners so that everything from the research questions and so on is a kind of shared endeavor. I mean, I guess the other thing I would say is a lot of the people who come on our protected fellowship scheme and more generally experienced practitioners, the thing they don't have time to write about is because they're on the kind of is their learning, right? Is to reflect on their learning. And if universities can provide spaces where people could do that in a fellowship scheme or in some other way, I think it would be a really valuable thing for both for the NGOs, but also for academia, because some people, if you've got 20 or 30 years of working on a given issue, the kinds of learning that you will have will be invaluable to others. Melly's given me, you should stop there, Paul. Look, so I think.
Yes, so I'm using the look because I'm quite far from the speakers. I can't pass the notes around. But I think thank you for engaging frankly on this topic and courageously. I think we've been invited to be courageous. We've been invited to have the uncomfortable conversations where we are not comfortable with the norm and what we're doing and thinking that it's enough. But let me just close briefly by stepping back and saying across, I think, different perspectives that we've had, there's a common thread that universities are operating in environments marked by shrinking space and even political freedoms. At the same time, universities themselves are navigating institutional constraints, political pressure, reputational risk. But there's also another factor here, that there is an assumption, or maybe it's an observation, that they operate with some relative, there's still some kind of a space that is not as affected as civil society. I think even if you look at Civicus 2024, you look at Freedom House, they characterize how freedom is vanishing, how countries are not progressing in terms of democratizing. But there's the VDEM report about freedom, academic freedom index, which basically shows you some bit of openness, some bit of universities having this kind of academic freedom. So I think it's up to us to then interrogate what do we do with that space. Does it really exist? In what form does it exist? As Scholars at Risk and SCI reports would also warn us that, this is not for granted. There's a lot that's going on in universities, even though the global picture may look as if there is space. So this panel has set the context. The sessions that will follow take a conversation forward, making the existing work, examining collaboration in practice, and engaging with the guidelines for universities hosting human rights defenders, and ultimately asking what do we do with the space that exists within universities, however limited it might be, challenge ourselves to be innovative, be courageous. And thank you to our panelists. Please give them a round of applause. And in absentia, I would also like to thank our Vice Chancellor for coming and also helping us set the tone for this symposium. I would like to invite all of us to enjoy tea for the next 15 minutes. And then hopefully I'm kicking the can down the road. The next session will have to recover the time that we ate it. Can I make an announcement?
Hi, everyone. Just before everyone steps out, we would just like to know if everyone had access to Wi-Fi. There is the Wi-Fi name and the code. And then if you could just scan the snap scan just to have a look at our website. And please do follow us on socials. And one last announcement, in this venue, they're quite strict. We can't bring food inside, but you can have your drink if you can just have some tea and all the food in the foyer, and you can come in with your drink only. Thank you so much.
I'd like to clarify from his Rector's chatting house room episode.
No, there's no social media, but we'll only have the camera up. So
I'll report right after that. But can I want
just to make it
we can break. Yeah, after that. It's all a closed door session. Or do you expect to have a citation or actions? Just gonna change back. Yeah. It's the one